Welcome back to Godless Reads, the chilling tales for dark night show, where godless authors read their own wacky, crazy, silly, sneaky, mischievous, terrifying, super fresh, ultra radical stories. I'm Drew Stepek, owner of Godless.com, the Godless app, and horror author myself. Notice that I said godless authors reading their own stuff. This isn't creepypasta. This isn't narrated mainstream horror stories. These are underground, independent horror authors reading their own work the way they want you to hear it. On this week's episode, our good friend, the mysterious Professor, reads In Blood. In Blood is a narrative version of a fictional letter that actor Henry Irving wrote to his good friend and director, Bram Stoker. The Professor is a mysterious character we don't know much about. I do know that he's exclusive to the Godless platform, for now, and I also know that he is a professor in real life. He's won over the Godless audience with his butter voice and his awesome stories that are a real throwback to a different time. But you can feel the modern element of everything he does. So kick back, grab a smoothie and a bag of crisps, and enjoy In Blood. As you may have noticed, I didn't swear at all, and I toned down my irritatingness as much as possible for episode 4 of Godless Reads. But I can tell you that those warnings are in place for a reason. This story is fucked up.
In Blood. A letter from Henry Irving to Bram Stoker, December 1888. My dear Stoker, well, we have triumphed. I do believe we have given London a Macbeth of unrivaled intensity, power, and above all, horror. Every night, 2,000 people swoon before me, and I have no doubt I then prowl their nightmares. Now they can attach a face to the mysterious and inhuman devil who has been tearing through their newspapers and their waking thoughts for these past 4 months. As I steep myself in blood, they can project their worst fears onto me. The theatre is the place for catharsis, and we've never known that to be more necessary than it is now. I have much to thank you for, my dearest friend. Your unwavering commitment to my artistic ambitions has been my sharpest spur. Over these past few years, you have assisted me in more ways than I can mention. The life and soul of this new production is, of course, mine to inhabit and embody, but the conception... Oh, my dear friend, you can take a great share of the responsibility for that. You are truly an artist, and your visionary gifts have always been evident in the words you write. Your descriptions of my performances show me the greatest picture of myself. Over the past few weeks, your masterful accounts of our rehearsals and discussions guided me in my anticipation of how my public would respond to this latest portrait, and informed me as I shaped my character. I paid particular attention to your observations of my eyes. All along, you've noted the fact that the mind of my Macbeth is clearly being assailed by terrible phantoms from the very beginning, and that this is overwhelmingly evident in my terrifyingly haunted gaze. You've stated that it is clear I am seeing unspeakable things, my mind already being full of the most violent thoughts of murder. My friend, you do not know quite how much truth you have perceived, or indeed, what horror you prompted. This, my dear friend, is why I have put pen to paper. You will no doubt be wondering why you're receiving such a long letter from me when we're spending so much of every day, and indeed most evenings, in each other's company. The reasons will become increasingly clear as you read on. In short, I want to pay tribute to your own art. I want to show you in as much detail as possible what your art has awakened in me. And in doing so, I hope I will spur you on to a greater triumph. You have yet to write your masterpiece, my dear Stoker, but I think that perhaps the roots of it
might be here in our current experiences. Allow me to step off the stage and onto the page, as I have done before in so many of your wonderful reviews and notes, but this time as a figure who cannot be contained by recollection and description, this time as a figure of such dark and savage ferocity that you will struggle to recognize him, or indeed to recognize the part of you that can understand and relate to him. I want to show you the black depth of my soul. I assure you, you will not be able to find a clear, conventional way of repeating or recreating what you are about to read. You're going to have to find a new way of expressing yourself in order to capture the essence of the demonic atrocity you are about to encounter. You're going to have to find the true artist lying dormant in you, the artist who will still consider himself a true friend to me, the artist who will acknowledge he possesses a similarly black soul. The artist who can find a way of suggesting horrors greater than anyone else has yet managed to convey in popular print. The artist who is ready to write the book of the century, just as that century gasps its deathly, decadent, final breaths. Are you ready then to come with me? Have you settled yourself? Perhaps with a strong drink? This is going to be a long night, my friend. At the end of it, you will be an irrevocably changed man. You will not think yourself changed for the better. No, not at first. But that will come with time. As I said earlier, my Macbeth gives a face to the devil currently stalking the streets of London, mutilating prostitutes. Did I need to write that? Is that phrase rather too salacious? That's the point, isn't it? Every night we are aware of the thrill of terror I provoke in my audience. They are compelled by my appalling character. They cannot tear their eyes away from him. They're willing him on to greater and greater atrocities. They're all too ready to wade with him into an ocean of blood that he perceives. In the same way, they are compelled by the monster in their streets. They wait anxiously and excitedly for the time he will strike again. They hope the next one will be even more abominably brutal than the last. And here's the thing, my dear Stoker. People want to believe that there is something noble about this beast. They're aroused by that paradox, the possibility that this hideous murderer might be a member of the aristocracy, perhaps even royalty. Of course they are. It makes him something magnificent, grand, a figure of classical drama. It makes him truly and marvelously perverse. This, of course, adds to the frisson they're feeling when they behold my Macbeth, the butcher with a crown on his head and blood on his hands. Oh, my dear friend, if only they knew the truth. I suspect you've sensed something loosely connected to the truth, but have been too frightened to voice it. You know, of course, of my recent meetings with members of the Lodge. You must forgive me a moment of facetiousness when I reflect on how apt the name Savage Club has become. Well, my friend, you have of course been right not to pry into the grave matters we have had to confront. But as I'm now going to reveal a series of terrible truths to you, let me begin with this. We senior Masons have for a while now been addressing the crisis prompted by the birth of a child to young Prince Albert Victor. This child, born as it was to a low Catholic girl, simply could not be acknowledged or even tolerated in any way. Arrangements were made to commit the mother to an asylum, certified as a lunatic and effectively silenced. However, the mother's friend, who had been acting as a nursemaid to the child, saw an opportunity to profit from all this and joined with a group of prostitutes in an attempt to blackmail figures in the prince's circle. This, I am sure you can appreciate, was a fatal mistake. Now, I'm sure you can already see how this situation would have excited me. A group of loose women existing in the shadows on the fringes of our world, gathering together to toy with the fates of royal figures. A desperate and demented woman raving under the watchful and controlling eyes of physicians. Here were my witches and my lady. In the interests of helping Ellen with her performance, I visited the mother. I saw a young, betrayed, raging, hapless girl, painfully aware that she would never see her child again, and driving herself mad with grief and fury. I took much from her, noting that here were gestures, intonations, and moments of appalling, haunted silence and stillness that would work so well in the presentation of my tragic wife. I also wanted to accompany certain other members of the lodge in their planned visits to the prostitutes, but I was not allowed. Only the men of action were expected on those occasions. The reason, of course, was to be clear soon enough. Their work was to be swift and ruthless. It had been naive of me to assume it would be otherwise, but I soon accustomed myself to the grim necessity of what was taking place. And indeed, I became consumed by it. Let me now at last admit to you, my dear Stoker, that every time I have performed my encounter with the witches, I have seen 3 of the 4 victims of the street slayings, the 3 whose guts were ripped out and displayed. That is the horror you're seeing in my eyes at that moment. And they move towards me, Stoker. They move towards me, sometimes lumbering, sometimes crawling, their bellies open and gaping, guts trailing, blood frothing and bubbling in their chattering mouths. Oh, my friend, it is a wonderful image. What a gift! The power of it never falters. As they get closer to me, they draw their straggling hair away from their necks and reveal the deep tears in their throats. They allow their heads to sway and tilt at impossible angles, cackling hideously, leering at me with black eyes. Sometimes I imagine them actually crawling over me in a mocking act of physical possession, running their tongues and hands over me, smearing me with their blood. They whisper their prophecies to me, and then, to make the provocation complete, they produce the prince's child, the baby that must be denied, taunting me with my lack of issue and with the idea of my rival's future son. I know I shouldn't want it, but I find myself wanting them to destroy the infant, and I gaze with a mix of fascination and revulsion as they obey my darkest bidding, ripping the limbs from the tiny body and biting into the flesh. Now you can see how well I am prompting Banquo to ask why I start and seem to fear these witches. Has any actor ever delved so deep into this character? Has any actor before now had such an opportunity to bring real horrors to the stage? Well, my dear friend, I've gone further than this. Much, much further. I have not needed to find any real human association in those witches. They are mere spirits, after all. It is therefore entirely fitting that I never actually met or even saw any of those unfortunate girls who met their vicious ends in the streets. But as we got further with our preparations for this play, I realized I had a valuable opportunity. Ultimately, I have to look at my wife with an even greater sense of horror. She must appear to me as someone whose humanity has been perverted, twisted, torn and pulled beyond all recognition. I need to be shocked by her, and part of that shock needs to be the awful realization of what she is stirring and revealing in me. I need to see my own twisted and perverted self reflected in her. I realized at this point that I needed to see a victim. I needed not just to see this woman, but to commune with her, to share some meaningful and intimate time with her before her death, even if that was simply in her very last seconds. I needed to know her, to understand her, to feel sympathy for her, perhaps even desire for her. I suspected I could get all this from observing the look on her face when the terrible moment of understanding set in, the knowledge that her precious life was about to be cruelly and savagely ripped from her. The sense of life, vitality, potential, the opportunities for love and happiness, for everything a young woman might desire would, in that brief, sharp moment, that heavy heartbeat, be at their fullest. I would see everything that mattered to her come into her eyes, the memories, the dreams, the longings, the regrets. Perhaps I would see the sudden desire for revenge, the final rush of fury. That is, of course, what I wanted, what I needed. And then I needed to see her twisted and torn beyond all recognition. I needed not just to see the results, I needed to see it happen. Imagine my excitement, therefore, when I learned that the next target was to be the friend of the mother, the nursemaid who was at the heart of the blackmail plot. My mind became feverish as I thought of this. It seemed as if time and fate were collaborating to assist me in my artistic quest. Time was anticipating my dread exploits. A nursemaid, a woman who had given suck and yet was probably now full of bitterness and hatred towards the child who had dragged her into a nightmare. A woman who, if sufficiently pressed, might truly renounce all the feminine kindness and maternal instinct in her soul and think instead of dashing out the brains of that child. I do not, of course, mean that I wanted actually to see her do such a thing, but I was determined to hear her express it. I was determined to see if I could create the monster my wife becomes. I wanted to have an encounter that would haunt, terrify, and inspire me, something that would enable me to bring unspeakable terror to the stage. So, my dear Stoker, I made arrangements. I dined with the very men who had committed the previous murders, an act which in itself helped me in further preparations for my role. These were not, of course, the hired thugs of Macbeth's shadow world. They were powerful, calculating, influential men. I need say no more than that. I am revealing great secrets to you, my dear friend, but names need not be a part of this. You know exactly the kind of men I'm describing. You may be able to guess some of their identities, but it is not my business to expose these figures fully to you. I need only be concerned with exposing myself. It is our own close relationship, after all, that is being served here, and besides, you will soon see that what I ultimately did is so much more terrible than any of these other men that their parts in this ghastly episode will become almost insignificant. You know, of course, that the woman's name was Mary Kelly. You know as well that the key difference between her death and the others is that she was killed in her own meagre and frankly rather sordid room off Dorset Street. The first revelation I offer you, my friend, about this most appalling of murders is that it was my suggestion to place the atrocity in her home. It was more than a suggestion. It was a request. I needed this for my own dark purposes. I wanted to see her at her most vulnerable, her most open. I wanted to get to the heart of her. Lady Macbeth summons the murdering ministers, the spirits of total evil, to her own chamber. She invites them to penetrate to the essence of her most private being. I needed Mary Kelly to feel that she had done the same, albeit unwittingly. And so the deed was carefully planned. There would be 4 of us. 1 to meet and proposition the victim, buying from her an agreement to come back to her room with her. 2 to perform the murder. I learned that these 2 were the regular killers, and they'd made a gentleman's agreement to work as a pair so that neither would carry the sole responsibility for the inhuman acts they were committing, and so that they could be ready to take over from each other during the process of the act itself if the task became either too physically challenging or spiritually shattering. And 1 more, me, to stand as witness. And a witness is all I expected to be, my dear Stoker. I did not expect to be carried away in the manner I shall describe soon. I might, of course, have thought about prompting her to say certain things as the knife was held to her throat, but I did not expect to become physically involved. In short, I certainly did not expect to end up with blood on my hands. And so much blood. Looking back now, I cannot claim to be surprised by my actions. However vile they may have been, I was standing in the wings of a theatrical ritual, a planned performance. How could I not play a part? And how could I not naturally allow fate to take its course, and for that part to be a leading role? So I was there, my friend. I was in that room, in Miller's Court, number 13. Permit me once again a moment of facetious reflection. My mind happily entertained all sorts of ideas of superstition, black magic, and twisted fate. Happily? Do I really mean that? Yes. Let it shock you, as I'm sure it must. I stood happily in the shadows of her room, eagerly awaiting her arrival and her murder. I was not the tormented Macbeth, cut in two by his conscience as he commits himself reluctantly to his own murderous task. Let me be clear. I expected to be more than troubled by what I was about to witness. I expected to see and hear things that would harrow my soul. But I wanted it. Oh, how I wanted it. Because I knew what magnificent and lasting use I would make of it. Mary Kelly was about to be immortalized in more ways than one. I had no doubt that the details of her murder would be documented and indeed exaggerated, not only in the press, but in the history books. But more importantly than that, if ultimately more secretly, she was about to become the essence of a performance that would be celebrated for the rest of time. I chuckle as I recall this. One final moment of facetiousness, my patient friend. I can only imagine what revulsion you must be feeling towards me as you read this, and while I can promise you such feelings are about to get much stronger, they will ultimately transform into admiration. In the meantime, however, let me enjoy this last wry reflection. When finally I heard her outside, assuring our colleague in a very alluring voice that he would be comfortable, I heard her then utter the words, "I've lost my handkerchief." Can you imagine my delight? She was already Desdemona, beautiful victim of manipulation and focus of intense, feverish, destructive obsession. Already I could feel my sympathies, both personal and artistic, extending towards her. Here was the innocent and dangerously beautiful tragic heroine. The first part of my hope was already fulfilled. Now I had to see the monster. The door opened. As she led our colleague into the room, her back was turned to us. It gave me all the time I needed to take in her figure, her soft blonde hair, the delicate hands that were clasping those of our colleague, drawing him towards her. In that moment, I knew, even without looking at my fellows, that we shared the same response. We were momentarily mesmerized. She was as beautiful as we had heard. This was a young woman who had clearly fallen on hard times in a genuinely pitiful way. There was something sweet and powerfully compelling about her. We had not yet looked into her eyes, but already we were under some kind of spell. Time and action seemed to slow down. We watched as those delicate hands reached for the face of our colleague. We watched and understood as he kissed her. And we knew at that moment that her destruction would have to be brutal and total. Something had been aroused in us that needed to be purged. He turned her towards us. I was riveted. The look on her face was at first one of sensual abandonment, the full lips slightly parted, the eyes unfocused but unmistakably bright, warm. She had placed her hands over his as he turned her, and she was drawing them down over her body. We were there to exercise the most terrible form of power over this poor girl, but at that moment she was the one who had power over us. Only she could break the spell. The transformation we needed was, of course, inevitable and imminent. But even so, the rapidity was startling. The moment her eyes focused, she noticed us, and a scream rose in her throat, but both throat and mouth were, of course, quickly blocked by the swift and powerful hands of our colleague. As my other two fellows moved in on her, I saw the most hideous change in her eyes. At first they widened in mortal fear, but then very quickly narrowed. They focused on me, and my dear Stoker, I will admit to you that they directed towards me such an overwhelming sense of judgment and hatred that I swooned. I began to sway, held by that awful but magnificent gaze. My friend, those eyes spoke to me, and they expressed everything I had wanted to hear. "Come, you murdering ministers," those eyes hissed. "I will pour thee in the dunnest smoke of hell. Unsex me here." I understood her. Just moments ago, she was ready to abandon herself to the lascivious hands of a man, but now she was giving herself to far more. She was offering herself, body and soul, to the darkest forces of damnation. She was commanding us to rip the very essence of her womanhood from her, but she was letting us know that we would be damning ourselves in doing it. Come, then, to damnation and triumph. Let us all become monsters together. I watched one of my fellows push his knife deep into her neck and slice along her throat in two hard, wrenching movements. The awful tearing of flesh, the hiss of life escaping, the bubbling of blood, all made strange and marvelous music. I could not distinguish the imaginary from the real in these sounds. My delirium was beginning. Still, she was looking at me through misted, strangely undead eyes, and I could still hear a voice, harsh, compelling. "Come," she commanded. "Make other wounds. Make a chaos of my body." "Yes!" I cried in feverish answer. "Yes!" My fellows looked at me quizzically, but there must have been something about my eager convulsions that amused them. They must have thought I was expressing a manic delight at the violence I'd just witnessed. They could have no idea I was expressing obedience. When I asked for the knife, they smiled at each other, and the fellow who'd begun the deed happily passed it to me. "Please feel free to give rein to your imagination," he said to me. "We need to make this look like the work of a madman." I instructed them to lay her down on the bed. "Observe, gentlemen," I said, as I knelt over her. "We must do her bidding. This is not madness. It is art, and it is a privilege." Their smiles disappeared at that point. I would like to think the true gravity of our purpose began to take hold. My task was clear to me, and I expected that as they watched me, they would reach a suitable state of reverence. I placed my ear to her open neck. This was now where I was sure I could hear her voice. I listened carefully. "Gentlemen," I said, "she's instructing us to undress her. Come, please assist." I think I was beginning to win the respect I expected. Certainly, there was an awed silence as my fellows assisted me. The silence continued as we all gazed upon her nakedness. Even with her ravaged neck, there was still a strong, sensual power to her. I knew what I had to do. I instructed two of my fellows to hold open her legs. I placed the tip of the knife at the entrance to her sex. I looked into her eyes. They stared back at me, into me, filling me with a sense of savage certainty. I thrust the knife into her and felt her body heave towards me. I know I was lifting it, but I was equally sure she was pushing herself upwards to meet the blade. I was convinced that somewhere within this demon's spirit there was still a sense of feeling. She was neither alive nor dead, but somewhere in between. And as I drew the knife up, tearing through womb, stomach, lungs, and what was left of her throat, I heard a terrible, guttural scream rising from the depths of her hell-bound soul. It was a cry of rage and pain, but also a roar of defiance, a challenge to unleash all my own demonic fury and desire. It filled me with an extraordinary sense of elation. Before I was really aware of what I was doing, I began to remove my own clothes. I wanted to feel my own flesh sinking into her blood. "I'm doing your bidding," I whispered to her, pressing her profusely bleeding body close to me, wallowing in her viscera. I plunged my hands into the pit of her open stomach and took hold of a coil of intestine. I chuckled as I began to tug at it. "Here is the serpent that I once told you lurks under the innocent flower. Your flower is far from innocent. This serpent has nowhere to hide." And with that, I wrenched and tore the whole gut free from her body. I held it aloft for my fellows to see. They'd asked for savagery. They wanted hideous lunacy. They were watching a master at work. I turned back to her. "Now," I said, "tell me what I must do next." "Come to my woman's breasts," was the distant reply from somewhere deep within her throat. "Ah, yes," I responded. "The very breasts you would pluck from the boneless gums of a child before dashing his brains out." "Yes," came the weird reply. "You know me. Now help me. Prepare me for my passage to hell." My dear Stoker, I let myself be guided by this powerful, undead spirit. I let her possess me completely, and I followed her bidding to the letter. I took my knife to her breasts and traced their outlines carefully, lovingly, with the point, in a mocking parody of a child's innocent finger as it suckles, or a lover's teasing caress. And once I'd made my incisions, I dug in the blade and lifted the flesh from the body. Again I heard agonized and yet strangely elated moans and gasps from somewhere deep within her. Or perhaps now they were within me, as I absorbed myself in my hideously satisfying task. I removed the freshly sliced pieces of flesh from her chest and sat back to look at the ruin of her body. Her whole torso was the chaos she had wished. I now turned my attention to her face. I leaned in to kiss against those cold, open lips. I could feel myself stirring once more. "I have to remove your mask," I said to her soft, silent, open face. This time she made no reply. I took this as acceptance, agreement, permission. I began with the lips I had just kissed, cutting away the full, fleshy essence of that sensual mouth. And then something remarkable occurred. Having let my knife violate the mouth that had exerted such a powerful sensual compulsion in me, I now gave it free rein. I let it guide my hand and watched in a trance as it slashed at her cheeks, her nose, her ears. Within minutes, the whole mask of her face was removed, leaving only her eyes, still staring with the same defiant desire from a gaping, bloody, beautiful pit of bone and gristle. Not so much a skull as a new mask, a mirror of my violent compulsion. For a moment, there was silence. And then one of my fellows gasped the words, "That was extraordinary." "Yes," I replied. "Gentlemen, I must thank you for allowing me to accompany you tonight. You've allowed me to immerse myself totally in the demonic world of the play we will be presenting to London in just over a month's time. You have aided the artistic pursuits of an acclaimed actor, and you can rest assured that the performance you've helped me to create will be documented in awestruck literary appreciations that will live on long after we've taken our leave of this world. You have allowed me to look into the abyss by letting me create that abyss in a human body. What kind of monster does that make me? A considerable one, I hope. Otherwise, I have nothing to bring to my art or my public." My fellows confirmed that they felt they had witnessed the action of an artist. I felt the reverence I had expected. I asked them to help me display the various parts of the body I'd ruined, partly because I was relishing the challenge of engaging imaginatively with the idea of how an obsessed, inhuman lunatic might choose to present the results of his violent crime, but also because I wanted my fellows to feel a physical connection with this powerful, magnificent spirit. This was no ordinary woman. This was no ordinary blood. They would be blessed to have it on their hands. So there you have it, my dear Stoker. I need not describe the ways in which we chose to distribute and present that marvelous woman's flesh and organs. This has all been well documented. Thousands of words have already been written about this crime, as you know, even though it's only less than 2 months old. Many more words will be written yet. There'll be more letters from the Ripper, all fabrications, all false trails. Most will be written by my associates in various lodges as they work to keep the legend alive, to deflect attention from the truth. Some of those letters may even be written by me. I now have more than enough understanding, more than enough experience to make my own contributions to the myth. In the meantime, it should be obvious to you, night after night, that I am drawing on my experiences of murder and mutilation in my performance. You've told me that I make the stage seem genuinely haunted, especially during the banquet scene. And so it is. But my dear Stoker, as I have said already, the person who stands most to gain from this entire experience is you. I have nothing to lose by describing my part in it to you. I know you will keep the contents and revelations in this letter close to your heart. Masonic code and your own personal loyalty will ensure that. But there is something else. as I suggested earlier. You have inspiration here, my friend. Take it. Use it. I came to feel that what we committed that night was not so much a murder as a willing sacrifice. That woman gave her life and her blood for our pursuits. The blood is the life, my dear friend. The blood is the life. And yes, perhaps I sacrificed an essential part of myself as well, not in losing blood, but in absorbing it, combining my own monstrous spirit with hers. And now we've opened the way for you. Take all of this, my friend. Use your own art to transform it into a remarkable story. One perhaps of blood, of undead spirits, of monstrous women, of dark desires, of secret plots and murderous missions. No one need ever know the truth at the heart of it. It's calling you, my dear Stoker. Your task, your destiny. The blood is the life. Yours, as ever, Henry.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.